this is where we would be in 2020, like just a few years ago. It's like, oh, global, you know, global supposed pandemic, although I mean it's kind of a little bit of a weenie pandemic if you ask me. And then rolling straight into basically a global rise up. If not global, then at the very least around the US. And yeah, I mean, check.
Well, I have heard that these are going global now.
Yes.
There are people in Amsterdam and Germany and all kinds of places.
Yes.
So
And
I
we
guess it counts as global now.
yes, and we appear to be
I don't hear
live.
anything about. We are live. I don't.
Yes.
I don't hear anything about them going
About the Taiwan, I mean, sorry, the Hong Kong stuff going on in China, but
Hong Kong.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
a different kind of a situation. So, hey, if everyone's tuning in right now, this is Live Free and Rant. We're at the 14th installment thereof. And that means what, 14 weeks straight. That's what, like 3.5 months or something like that. It's been a long time. Been a long
Something like that.
been a long time we've been ranting. We intended to do this for a little while before we started, and then we decided to start it, and then just then the cabin fever and the lockdown stuff. This has been a great time to just kind of do this because I think you remember the subject matter of like our original ones. We were like, oh, some police dude in northern New Hampshire, he rage quit, and all right, there's good. Okay, I ran out of a turkey
Oh,
today.
that was kind
Like,
of funny.
like we're definitely it definitely was just like the definitely this show definitely got swept along with the tide of the world just being crazy of like before you know it there was a lot of complaints to do about the pandemic response and then all the craziness in the world and then now at this stuff. I mean, what if 2020 just burns out all the crazy that's been pent up ever since, ever since the introduction of memes? I don't know why I blame the memes. So, ever since that happens, what if we burn through all the cool material eventually, and then we're back and being like, what was up with the Carter administration? And just old timers complaining about nothing. What if that happens? Seem a little quiet today, aren't you?
Well, I'm sorry. You broke up there for. I just like last week. I'm at home in the People's Republic of Peterborough with my very choppy internet connection. So
Hashtag
I
at home with
apologize if
me.
I stay silent for a few minutes while everything loads. And yeah, so I
Yeah,
mean, I just got
everything's working out fine.
once the internet catches up, I'll have plenty to respond to.
And that's unfortunately what seems to be happening with the world today is we've caught up with the internet. Is the internet's always been a fountain of craziness that's not really real world. And then now it's happening in real life. Like all those boogaloo memes, now it's all spilling out onto the streets. All the, oh, we're all gonna die, martial law, tanks, this, oh, but that's all spilling out there. All just the weirdest, wackiest things you'd expect anytime is all kind of happening. And in this up and down world, there's the big elephant in the room, which is the title of this whole thing. But before we hit that, might as well hit up. Now, the World Health Organization, right? They are now saying that the asymptomatic spread of coronavirus is very rare. Now, I'm showcasing a couple tweets from Library because the Library, the Decentralized Content Protocol, because back just a few weeks ago, right? People saying this were getting removed from YouTube. Like, this was not because the World Health Organization had not caught up to that reality yet. People saying this kind of stuff were just censored off of YouTube, just like immediately. Not just. I'm not just talking about those wild-eyed conspiracy theory type videos. Oh, they're lying to us. Like respected, discussion on this kind of thing. Just censored, completely gone. And now all of a sudden it's like reversed. But are all those people going to get uncensored now? Are they coming back? I don't think so. So it's pretty clear that this has been just a giant power grab to just try to control the narrative, make sure everything works out, and especially that now it's very politically convenient to be able to be a little bit more truthful about the virus. Now, it's probably not that big of a deal now that you have mass protests in person, shoulder to shoulder, and yeah, it's pretty freaky.
Well, the virus is smart enough to stay away from the protests, obviously. Mm-hmm. It's for the safety of the virus. The virus knows that it's not safe there, so it stays away.
Which does remind me, I believe that, do you remember that speedway up in the north of the state that declared, that basically held their event despite lockdown orders or people say, they're not supposed to be able to open, have a big crowd. So now they, then Governor essentially threatened them a little bit, said, you can't do this again. And so they said, oh, we're not going to do this. And now they're doing it again, but now they're calling it a protest. They're just saying, oh, we're all going to be protesting up on the speedway. I think
this is that's a different racetrack. I'm pretty sure. But yeah, so
I got it confused.
It's a different racetrack. This one, the one that you're talking about, is it's in North Carolina.
Oh, okay.
Racetrack you're talking about, they opened 2 weeks ago. They put, they had social distancing going on. They were giving out hand sanitizer, giving out masks to people that wanted them. Mm-hmm. And the attorney general came in and basically they threatened them with like $20,000 fines. So the guy said, and I talked to the owner of the speedway myself. I called him and I said, I'm writing a story about your speedway. Anything you want to comment? And he goes, and he didn't really want to talk to me. But we ended up just having a conversation. And I was saying, it's kind of crazy that they're threatening you to threaten you with these fines or worse. And he goes, well, that's big government for you. So, I mean, the guy is more liberty leaning than anything else. And he was just, disgusted with the way the government handled it. He said, we followed all the protocols. He said, it's crazy. And this was before any of these massive protests were going on. It was after the reopened New Hampshire protests, but it was before all of these marches that were going on every single day in cities across New Hampshire and across the country. So far, I think one's happened in every city. I know that it happened in Portsmouth. It happened in Hampton, which isn't a city, but that's fine. Mm. It happened in Manchester. It's happened in Concord. It happened in Nashua. One happened in Salem. One happened in Keene. We had it in Peterborough. A couple hundred people again the other day for the second version of it. So those are all completely acceptable, but you can't go pay to participate in motorsports or to spectate motorsports. You can't, you can sit on the beach now. That happened last week. You can go sit on the beach. You can stand on the beach. You can walk on the beach. They still have every other parking spot closed, but you can stand on the beach, which is nice. You can sit on the beach. So that kind of took the wind out of the third reopened New Hampshire protest. They were going to, quote unquote, storm the beaches on D-Day, which
they did. But,
I'm not a comms expert. But that didn't seem to be good optics, in my opinion. But that's fine. Everybody, it's a free country. Well, sort of, right? They decided to do a Storm the Beaches event on the anniversary of D-Day. I wouldn't say it's bad. I just don't think it was the greatest.
It wasn't a bad optics. It was really just
it didn't really drive home your message.
It's a deflated optics kind of thing. It's like, yeah, no one cares, kind of. Unfortunately, because it's great that people have been standing up to actually their right to live their life as they have been peacefully before. It's just now that people can kind of do what they want. Like, it's kind of takes the wind out of a lot of that sails. Yeah, fact check. This is not a free country. Thanks, Elliot. He's such a downer. Well, I mean, things are getting better, okay? They're getting better. We're trying our best. I've lived the same way, other than a private business forcing me to wear a mask for I counted it, no more than 10 seconds on my little walk over to my table. But that was a private business that wanted me to do that. It wasn't. I don't think it was mandated. So other than that, I've been living the same way, so. Free country for me, I guess.
I think
is that what they call half-white privilege?
To an anarchist, this is never going to be a free country.
Mm-hmm.
If you're an anarchist, you're never going to live in a free country because it's not going to exist unless you buy your own private Jeffrey Epstein style island. But we're never going to be a free country. You're never going to be free to do whatever you want. It's just not a reality. And you're never going to convince a majority of people that to live in an anarchistic society. Mm-hmm. It's true, though. Yes, the U.S. gets less free all the time. The government is always growing. They're always expanding their powers. I don't know if we'll ever look like Cuba. It's certainly colder than Cuba, and we don't have as good cigars. So,
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, too.
But that's something that's worth pointing out, though, is we basically everywhere in the world, but in particular the U.S., just rose up against big government. Now, it's not exactly as ideologically lasered in as that, but basically, hey, you can't just beat the crap out of us and abuse us for no reason, is the overarching message. A lot of it has been kind of pushed towards race because some races have been affected more or disproportionately by this thing, but it's still like against the boot on the neck. It's been very clear that that's the one kind of overarching kind of thing, and I mean that's pretty cool. Like, if you think about, like, how is it touchy when you talk about vandalism and things like that, like burning down the police department? Like, I don't know if I like that necessarily. In part of me is just like, woo, because it's like, wow, you actually went all the way, but then, you know, of course, it's always not good to destroy property and potentially hurt people. But it's funny because, just hitting on the last little bit of Rona before hopefully we never have to talk about it again on this show. Basically, the protests have been all over the place, you know, shoulder to shoulder, everywhere. There have been no, like, the whole, you can't do because Corona, okay. And not long ago, the government of, I believe it was in North Carolina again, said that protesting is not a non-essential activity. Well, now it's apparently extremely essential. And it hasn't been said by the powers that be that, oh, the virus isn't still able to infect people during protests. It's never been said anything like that. It has just been deemed an acceptable risk for that kind of an activity. You know, risk of the business is in it's an essential.
Well, as long as it's for only if it's for an important cause, though.
Yeah, of course. Only if it's for the deemed correct cause.
For the deemed correct cause. 4 or 5, 6 weeks ago, when the Reopen New Hampshire protest started, everybody was losing their minds. And I was just looking at tweets on this topic. You know, there were Democrat state reps and governor candidates, and they're all out there saying, oh, you know, there's nothing peaceful. Well, let me see if I can find an exact one here. I think it was Deborah Altschiller, who is one of the most outspoken lunatic state reps.
That's your
buddy. In New Hampshire. And she's my buddy. She said, there's absolutely nothing peaceful about endangering almost found the exact tweet. It is absolutely nothing peaceful about endangering, you know, the health and safety of your household and your family and frontline care workers and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, basically calling the Reopen protesters, you know, basically just dangerous recalcitrants, like, oh, you're going to kill everybody. Everybody's going to die. David Muse, state rep from Portsmouth, was you know, in 2 to 4 weeks, or in about 2 weeks, they're going to be hoping for some miracle cure. And Chairman Buckley of the Democrat Party was out there saying, oh, look at all these protesters out there protesting for the right to die and all of that craziness. But now our last weekend was the first of these Black Lives Matter marches and protests, at least here in New Hampshire, June 1st. Maybe I think it was June 1st that was the first one, or maybe the end of May, whatever the date was. But 1,000 people gathered, and they were closer than 6 feet. It seemed like most people were wearing masks, which is fine. But they were closer than 6 feet together. 1,000 of them marched down Elm Street in Manchester. And, I mean, they were mostly peaceful. They were peaceful on Elm Street. A couple went over to the police station after, a couple hundred, and maybe were looking to cause trouble, and not much happened, which is great. But all of a sudden, protests were completely acceptable. And even the governor, who has issued this order that says, no more than 10 can gather, all of a sudden he was tweeting about how he called the organizer of the Black Lives Matter protest, and he said, "We support you," and all that, which is fine, because I can agree with both causes, right? I don't think black people should be brutalized or assaulted by police. I don't think they should die at the hands of police. I think that's a pretty widespread belief that, especially what happened to George Floyd, where the guy kneeled on his neck. We talked about this last week. The guy kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes, and then he dies. And of course, the autopsy says all this other crazy shit, but whatever. You can agree with both causes. I can agree with reopening New Hampshire. I can also agree that Black lives do matter and that people should not die or be assaulted at the hands of police officers. But the double standard and the hypocrisy in that is what I love to point out, right? Because either protests are good or protests are bad. You can't have bad protests and good protests. The protest is a protest.
Well, yeah, as far as
either
the right
looting
to do
and
so.
looting and rioting, yeah.
Because I think a lot of protests can be really stupid.
I might not,
but I think they should be able to have.
Well, yeah, I can think they're stupid, but I support your right to have it.
So, and that's ultimately,
I support your right to say all the stupid shit you want to say.
That ultimately seems to have been the message that came across, was that it is risky to gather large groups of people. However, that is an acceptable risk for the importance of what you're actually there protesting. That's kind of the message that came across. Now, I guess I agree, and I just agree in a more broadly defined thing beyond just that protest. I think going to work every day is an acceptably important thing to accept a little bit of risk of infection. I understand it sucks. There's risks. I even think that going out and having a pint at a restaurant with other people close by is an acceptable. I mean, for me, I take full responsibility if I want to do that, there's a risk associated with that behavior. And just to, one, keep my sanity and the sanity of others, and two, to keep a small business from going under. It's a perfectly acceptable risk. Of course, the state did not deem those until recently to be acceptable risks, but it's kind of the same thing. It's all about personal responsibility and risks. And sometimes you got to do dangerous stuff. Sometimes you got to do stuff that puts yourself and others at a certain risk. Now, I got to be careful with how I say it, right? But you got to do stuff like that in order to accomplish something that's greater or more important. So, for example, if you every time you do anything related to firearms, some people will get a little on edge. They'll get, I don't know, maybe call the cops, maybe this, that people maybe start thinking, oh, this guy's a violent person because he's armed. There's always a risk of that, but the actual benefits of doing so, either for your own personal protection in the immediate time, or to just send a message that we should have the right to keep and bear arms, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a perfect normal activity, and even a responsible activity. That message is more important than the risk of, well, something goes off, people don't like seeing a gun, that kind of thing. And so that's all. I mean, that's also called being an adult, right? You're responsible for yourself and your own actions. There is no such thing as just a good and a bad action in absolute terms. Everything you do has a risk. If you decide to take a job for more pay, but you commute, you're inherently risking your life and the life of others by getting behind a wheel of that dangerous ball of iron that you're sending hurtling down with explosions down the highway every single day, that could smash into other people, that could kill yourself, kill others, and certainly will mulch a whole bunch of squirrels, especially if it's that insane squirrel season we went through not too long ago. But there's always going to be risk and costs associated with everything you do, and it's about taking personal responsibility for what's happening and also trying to weigh, is this a worthwhile risk? And that's all it's about. And let me just hit to the boog slide here, which I like everything about this tweet right here. First off, the Twitter account is named Duncan Lemp after the poor boog boy soul who got murdered by police in his sleep in a red flag warrant. The Twitter handle is called Mujahideen, which is one of my favorite words in the I guess the English language now. Anyway, it says Boogaloo boy attacking and provoking black protesters to riot. 2020 colorized, and you see a what conservatives would call a patriot, but what anarcho-libertarians would call a boog boy providing medical assistance to an injured protester. And so that kind of thing, people showing up in military style. Apparently, no one cared about military style as it applied to police until like last week. But when people are showing up with advanced weaponry or things like that, stuff that's not just something that James Bond would keep beneath his coat, a little Walther PBK. If it's anything bigger than that, it's military style. There's always that inherent risk that people think, these guys are coming looking for a fight because they're ready for a fight. Or, you're getting out there, you're threatening people. If you're protesting, you're showing some kind of resistance to a status quo. If you're protesting with a gun, you're implying you're going to start capping people. There's always that risk that people will perceive you that way or whatever. Or there's always a risk, and let's be very clear about this. If you show up with a bunch of your friends who are all well armed and with the best of intentions to protect a business from being ransacked or looted, there's always a risk that something goes awry, that someone does something sudden, someone behaves irresponsibly, someone gets shot, there's an escalation. Who knows? There's always, then the cops show up, they don't know who to shoot, so they shoot everyone. And there's always, again, life is risk. But I think that we're much better off in a world where people are willing to take up arms to defend their communities from, pillaging, ransacking, whatever else, or just from having the crap kicked out of them by police for protesting, are willing to do that. And especially if they're willing to do that while remaining as absolutely peaceful as possible.
Yeah, and we've seen these, boog boys showing up in cities across the country where violent looting and violent rioting has taken place because the police, in a lot of cases, have not stepped in to do their job, which is protect and serve. So when you have violent looting and violent rioting going on, the police jobs at that point is to come in and stop the violence, to protect personal property and to protect life. Mm-hmm. And we've seen a lot of these businesses being burned to the ground and the windows smashed in. But there's also been deaths, right? Like there's people that were defending their businesses that have died, or in many cases they were Black Americans. And they were either killed by protesters or killed with their businesses burning down or whatever the case may be. There was, I know a lot of people are sharing those stories on Twitter. You're not seeing a lot of it on mainstream media. I saw a story the other day that was, they brought on like 6 or 7 minority business owners who were talking about how they lost everything to the looters and the rioters. And they didn't, have necessarily the right insurance or what have you. So that's when you get these boog boys that show up to protect their community. Mm-hmm, and a lot of times they could be retired military. In Manchester, I was in Manchester Tuesday night when there was some rumor of violent BLM riots or looting that was going to happen. And I don't want to necessarily conflate it with BLM because it's not BLM. Antifa. There was supposed to be violent Antifa rioting or looting, or there was rumors of it. And the description of the Facebook event that ended up with somebody getting arrested said, we're going to mimic what's going on in cities across the country. We're going to burn cop cars. We're going to destroy shit, bring Molotov cocktails, bring all this stuff. And so there were I went down to Murphy's tap room that night and there were 24 boog boys there. And then we looked up on the rooftop behind Murphy's. There were another 12 boog boys up there. And we were connected via radio to a bunch of other boog boys over on South Willow Street. So there were at least 5 or 6 dozen of these quote unquote boog boys.
Sounds like a boog
just
apocalypse.
ready to protect life. It was, yeah, you would think so, right? And it was, they were ready to protect lives. They were ready to protect property in Manchester. Specifically, there were a bunch of just there to protect Keith Murphy's restaurant, the Murphy's Tap Room, or in the Murphy's Diner.
Murphy's Boog Room.
And they were just there to keep the peace. Murphy's Boog Room, we can rename it,
Yeah.
or rename the basement at least.
Yeah.
And the protesters came down, and they were getting in the faces of the Boog boys. They were yelling in their faces. They were, getting, why do you're just here? You just want to kill black people and yada, yada, yada. And we're like, hey, we kind of agree with why you're here, right? We don't think police should brutalize or assault or kill people either. Just protecting businesses. And they're, and they shut up and kept moving on. There were a couple cops that took knees with them. I mean, it was very
chaotic,
tame. Where we were on South Willow Street, they were doing dumb shit like lighting dumpsters on fire and shooting fireworks into the road, but nothing crazy over there either. So all in all, nothing like what we saw in New York, Chicago, or any of those
fucking Boston
assholes, as Trump would call them, right?
Assholes. Yeah.
Or even Boston, which is what, 30, 40, 50 miles away.
Yeah, stuff looked a little more tense in Portland, but doesn't look like there was a lot of violence or anything like that. It just looked like a lot more people, a lot more intimate with the police department building. But other than that, which kind of goes to this during this whole sweeping, I guess revolution of sorts. There's been famously in Minneapolis, I believe the city council has a veto-proof majority has discussed or expressed support for the dissolution of the police department, and this has led to this.
They voted on it this morning.
Yeah, so we're gonna see what happens now. This whole defund police hashtag has gone across, has completely swept around, and I have to admit to some nuance to this, unfortunately, because when I saw that, I'm just like, I started to get excited, but of course there's the nuance, which is, first off, defund does not only mean abolish and get rid of. It just could mean defund a certain group, a certain department, whatever. It mostly means radically reform policing is kind of the general thrust of that. And there's a whole bunch of different ways, but we can take it at its face value. So let me hit the last slide here really quick. And at the press briefing, the press secretary says, President Trump is appalled by the defund police movement, and she attributes it to Democrats and Biden supporters, of course, trying to make it political, which a lot of it is, let's be honest. At the same time, she says the president definitely recognized the horrid injustice done to George Floyd. Now, there's some nuance to that. Nuance is like the word of the day to just stop people from saying, oh, you just hate you for this and that. You're just stupid. You don't know what's going on. So, first off, it seems like all parties involved agree on the root, the nut of it, so to speak, which is George Floyd got pretty much murdered. That really sucked what happened to him. And also that should not happen again. That kind of thing should not happen again. There's all kinds of disagreements if he was like a hero or if he's this like evil felon person who did all kinds of horrible things in his past and kind of deserved not to die like he did, but bad things. Like, there's disagreement on that depending on which political side you talk to. And the biggest disagreement is, what do you do about it? Now, it seems like, it sucks. We hear you. We'll sort of tell cops to not do that as much anymore, is more of like the conservative side of things. And of course, the left side of things tends to be abolish the police or abolish / defund / community, make into a community run policing council or some like a bunch of other like much more extreme things. And I have to say, I mean, I usually end up not on this side. I'm more on the left side of things here, at least in so far as the fact that something like this has happened means something was really wrong. Like, something was wrong at its roots, it's not like, well, we'll just tweak something and make it better. It's like something's radically wrong if the whole world rises up. Look, the whole world rises up and is just ransacking city after city. I mean, some of the stuff is just inherently evil kind of behavior and intent. A lot of it is boiled over frustration from this kind of stuff that they're just like, we'll burn everything. Of course, I don't think that's good at all, as I made very clear. But here's the thing. I'd like to play with the idea of what do we do if we do get rid of police? You know, that seems like a lot of like boog boy mentality tends to sort of think like, oh, wouldn't that be great? So first off, we're talking about acceptable risk and things like this. There's a cost to the current state of policing, a financial cost for sure. There's also a cost in human blood, where, I mean, obviously, cops are supposed to kill bad people sometimes, or at least stop them, and let's just not consider that blood, even though it is. But like, just the fact of people that didn't need to die or get hurt that do. Yeah, I don't know. That's a large savings that if we could look at a way of cutting that cost out, I think that we would be so much better off. But first off, what do you think? What do you think about the prospects of getting rid of police completely? Before I go on in one of my little ideological rants.
I'm not sure it's possible, right? I mean, sure, like anything's possible, but I don't think even Minneapolis, they just voted to disband their police department.
Mm-hmm.
But Minneapolis would never be without police. The state police, the governor will send the state police in. The counties could send in county police if they have them. They could restructure, they could rename it something else. But, cities like that, you get hundreds of murders a year, maybe, depending on which city you're in. Like Chicago, I know just had 27 just this weekend. They have like 24 every weekend or every week. So who's gonna, and like, now I'm not a fan of how police interact in places, right?
Mm.
Or in general, like they're asked to do way too much. We create way too much crime, quote unquote. And now they pull people over for, driving around without a seatbelt. Like, isn't there something better they should be doing instead of harassing people driving around that aren't wearing a seatbelt? Yes, there are way better things they should be doing with their time. Instead of, harassing people selling illegal cigarettes in New York that ended up in somebody's death. The crime, a victim. That's my stance on it, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you're doing something that isn't affecting anybody else's rights, if you're not hurting them or taking their stuff or something along those lines, damaging their property, then it's not really a crime that you like, because every crime is either enforced at the end with jail or death. So when you make not wearing a seatbelt a crime, you're telling them that it's okay to put them in jail or kill them for not wearing a seatbelt because somebody with a gun is there enforcing that law. And well, people say, well, it's only a ticket. It's only a misdemeanor, or it's only a whatever kind of violation. But let's say, and we can go through the whole thing if we have to. I don't think we need to. I think people understand the concept that, when you're not wearing a seatbelt and you make it a crime to not wear a seatbelt, then a guy with a gun is going to pull over your car and give you a ticket. And if you don't, blah, 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 you end up in jail or dead. So if we're going to have police, which we are, police are not going to go away. And I mean, there are people advocating to just abolish police, just like they were advocating to abolish ICE, just like they're advocating to abolish the U.S. military, just like they're advocating all of these crazy ideas. But instead of abolishing the police, we should focus their attention on what they were originally meant to do, which is to protect and serve and prosecute or investigate and arrest actual criminals like rapists, murderers, and crimes that have victims.
Yeah.
Not, Joe Schmo who's smoking a blunt on the corner who's not hurting anybody.
Yeah, and this is one of those things where the concept of police is an invention. It's an invention made by human society to hopefully better the society and make things work. But as with every technology that's deeply rooted, every approach like that, there's ways of doing things better eventually, and sometimes you have to completely restructure your approach. Like, for example, if you live in a place with like public transportation that costs way too much, and you want a better way of getting around, like you can't just say, well, ban trains, ban the subway because it doesn't work. Like you have to also think like, hey, what would happen? What would work in its place? Okay, well, maybe people would be able to afford more cars. Maybe people who wouldn't afford the cars, maybe they could get in some kind of like volunteer ride sharing system, and like you could start like rethinking the whole structure. One thing is for sure that's very strange in this whole, when you think about where we ended up today, is police have sort of a dual role, and that means they end up doing one of them very poorly. They're kind of there for a couple things. The first thing that we always think about in a positive sense, anytime anyone says thank you first responders, any of this kind of rhetoric, when they're talking about that, they're talking about the role of defending the people, which is just protecting and serving, keeping people safe, chasing away criminals, all that kind of stuff, diffusing situations, making sure riots or protests don't turn into riots, things like that. That kind of stuff is one role, and it's completely different from the other role, which is to enforce laws. And they stand diametrically opposite a lot of ways. So, for example, that's why there's 911 immunity laws being passed or bandied about or whatever. It's because a lot of times people will call the cops, they'll call the ambulance or whatever if a friend of theirs is overdosing, but they don't want to because they will be arrested for using illegal drugs, which again, that's a whole nother discussion of terrible laws being in place and things like that. But there's the dual role of the police or of the public servant in this case, first responder, to protect and serve or to enforce laws. And they can kind of be at odds with each other. Now, if you have a angry drunk person screaming around in the streets and you want to keep, and he's like brandishing a sharpened stick or something like that, and you need to do something about that. First off, if you want to not cause trouble, if you want to actually stop that from being a problem, there's a completely different approach from the law enforcement approach. So if you go in, you just say, "Oh, listen, man, calm down. There's nothing to be excited about. Can you just put the stick down? We'll sit down next to you. You look hungry. Let me get you a food. Let me sit next to you. What's going on with your life, man?" And just defuse the situation. Now, of course, if in this struggle, he hits the cop or whatever, he backhands him, whatever. Like, if I don't have to worry about enforcing laws and I'm that person, I just shrug it up like, hey, wait, whoa there, big guy. But from a law enforcement's perspective, you just backhand an officer, you assaulted an officer, let's put the knee in the back and put the cuffs on. We got to charge him with all these things now. It's a completely different mindset, and I think those roles need to be completely sort of separated. And a lot of it is, I think we have way too many. I mean, of course, it's not a lot of data behind that specific opinion, but I think we have way too many police because they need to enforce laws, as in but I don't think they do, but you know what I mean. The job description is to enforce everything that's a law, and it's sold under this, we need to protect the people. So you have a lot of people that are doing just like the one thing, and they're kind of stretched too thin to do whatever. What I would like to do is just separate the two roles, have community protection, whatever, and have like a role that's just for protecting people and keeping them safe, and another role which is just for prosecution It's like bounty hunt, kind of like, you say sheriff and deputies and citizen militia on the one hand to keep everything safe, neighborhood watch patrols, that kind of stuff to keep everyone safe. Completely different, and they don't need to care about enforcing laws because that's not their job. And on the other hand, you would have like prosecutors and bounty hunters and things like that, right? People that go and, oh, we heard this person's this, we have evidence that this, we're going to hunt someone down and we're going to, put them in jail for whatever. Which, of course, my hidden agenda and all this is a lot as that second role I would like to just be able to mostly do away with completely, just or almost get rid of. But in the meantime, just separate the two of them. So that way, if you see a cop walking up to your door, if it's the one kind, you're like, oh, I can trust this guy because he's here to help me out, whatever. Or, if I'm, he's primarily there to help me and help keep the community safe. And not, oh, this guy's coming for me because that's what he does. He hauls people away in chains. So having those two different things, now you have all of a sudden people start trusting police again. If they're not mistrustful, oh, they, like you work with communities, there isn't this whole like divide in the communities if you just have those two separate roles. And generally speaking, like, this is one thing that I don't think that people really think too much through when they, like, people say, for example, what if I get laid off from my job? What am I going to do? I need unemployment. Okay, maybe, but think outside the box a little bit. What do you do if there is no unemployment and you get laid off from your job? What would you do? What would you figure out to feed yourself and your family? Well, I better start selling things. Maybe I'll find some stuff on eBay, buy it for cheap, and repackage it and resell it at a markup. Maybe I'll start doing it. Well, just start a business, landscaping and stuff. Maybe I'll, like, all the opportunity, the things you could do to still feed your family that are not a 9-to-5 and are not going on unemployment. That all of a sudden, what would you do if you had no choice? And I think we should try to think about that as far as policing is concerned, where if just don't be like, oh, don't buy on police, it's terrible. Okay, well, think of the idea. What would you do if the police didn't exist? What problems do you have? And what solutions could you find to those problems? You'd be surprised at stuff you could come up with. And I'm encouraging people to kind of take that analytical view and just see, like, well, what replacement for the concept of police that we have in our modern society could we possibly create that could possibly be different and better? Ooh, yeah. So it appears like, while in the middle of this glorious rant, the gods above us, i.e., the internet, praise be, has become really rough with poor Chris over here. I think he's a little too edgy for his own good out there in the part of the state that he's in. So he's being throttled, and he's being before you know it, he might be kicked off the internet entirely. He may be canceled because we know we have cancel culture. So we should probably keep this one short this week and be back with a roar next week when we have more reliable internet for all parties involved. But at the very least, you got a great rant out of both things. Our first couple of these were like 30 and 40 minutes anyway, and then we started getting into the hour-plus territory. So yeah, don't hold it against us. But subscribe wherever you found this, and I think at some point we'll start consolidating all the channels, so it's not quite like, oh, I'll follow on this one and this one on the other one, whatever. We'll probably start consolidating channels. Subscribe. Throw Chris a few bucks on the Patreon over there. If you got crypto, throw a few bucks right up there. And we'll definitely see you next week. And if you have any topics that you desperately want covered, or materials or things like that, feel free to send them our way. We do, come up with this stuff on our own, but definitely, speaking for myself, I would not be opposed to just to taking some audience things into consideration. Just like we read from the live chat when it's live, I would not mind taking some extra suggestions. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks, Chris, for beaming in from solitary confinement or for wherever you're at. And hopefully you join the 21st century before next week. And yeah, we will see you all later.